Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of P.I.P People in Property. I'm pleased to say Ismail from Apex Law has joined us today. How are you, Ismail? Thank you for coming down.
Thank you very much. How are you?
Yeah, great, thank you. How was the journey, all right?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad at all.
So before we sort of get into the deeper thick of it and get all like logistical and legislation with everybody, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the property law side of things.
Sure. So my name's Ismail Gozde. I'm one of the directors at Apex Law. I started at Stuart Co in North London. That's where I did my training contract, did my training there. Then I moved to Apex Law in 2018 after I qualified in 2016. And I've been obviously up to director here at Apex Law since then. So yeah, it's going well. The firm is always growing. We've just opened a branch in Leeds.
Nice.
So yeah, it's all good.
Going all over England, man.
Yeah, we're nationwide. I mean, the work we do is nationwide, but we'll come into that. But yeah, ultimately we got we are local still. So we got Bexleyheath, Crayford, Rainham in Kent, and Leeds.
Oh, brilliant. And how have you found, obviously, your journey since starting and progressing? How have you found things? Has it been a rocky road for you? Have you enjoyed it?
Oh, I've loved every minute, to be honest. It's a good industry to be in. Obviously, I started off taking the place of my superior who was pregnant, so it was really
Thrown in the deep end, I literally go.
I enjoyed that because you learn. You know, I didn't do the traditional start from the bottom, work your way up to a fee earner. I was chucked in. I was taught, spent hours after work learning quickly to learn on the job. But yeah, so I'm always grateful to where I came from and where I started from. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know you have to be quite strong-minded and strong-willed within this sort of industry sometimes.
Yeah, you have to make sure the clients are comfortable and happy that they're relying on you to get one of the biggest transactions in their lives through.
Definitely.
It's most important that you know what you're doing.
And have you found that, obviously, business was better before COVID, during COVID, or after, or has it not really affected you guys?
It's been an odd one, really, because obviously the stamp duty window, as I'm sure you were being in the industry, was madness. It was hectic. So, and I think that what that did was inflate the numbers, really. So what would happen is, although those numbers would get spread across the year, it was being funneled into the stamp duty window ends.
Trying to get all over the line.
Done before the stamp duty changes were implemented. So obviously the numbers there were ridiculously high. I think we're now at more of a normal numbers-wise. Obviously the latest economic downturn and things that have happened in
interest rates increasing
and things like that have affected it to the sense that, people are a bit more weary of what they're doing. I think people during COVID were like, oh, there's no stamp duty, let me go in and,
help deliver, buying whatever they can.
That's it, literally that. But the problem was they were probably going to their extremes when things like this happen. You're then playing in those boundaries. So I think people are just a bit more weary, maybe still buying and selling because, numbers are still decent. I just think they're,
reasonably priced now.
Reasonably looking at where they can reasonably come in at rather than going, actually, I'll go a bit over the odds because I'm not paying a stamp duty, so I'll cover it there.
Yeah, we found the same thing because they thought obviously they're saving on stamp.
Yeah,
property prices were pretty much the same. Well, when I say the same, they're paying the stamp duty on the property price.
Yeah, it was just inflated. It was just a bubble.
Inflated, exactly. Now we're finding that they're coming back down because let's say they're saving 2 to 5% on their stamp, whether it's their first time or second time buyers, or whatever it may have been, because obviously it comes in different levels and tiers, doesn't it? They were going over and over, and they're like, oh, I've got. Then they're using their rainy day money, and now we're at the rainy day. They can't get that money back out.
And I think what we're going to start seeing is more stock on the market. Because I think the thing about COVID was it cleaned up all the stock. I mean, as an agent, but it cleared all stock. So when you were looking at properties available, you had, the thing was people were still selling because there was only, say, argument's sake, 5 properties on the market, but 50 people still wanted to buy.
Yeah.
So because the stock reduced, you were still looking at, it still seemed busy, even though the numbers had...
You had more competition for the same property type thing. I got pretty lucky, to be fair, in the COVID. I bought a little one-bed then, but I managed to sort of get it under the market value for the simple reason that we sort of locked down as I was going through the process. And it was like 3 weeks away from completing. And I'm like, no one can do viewings, no one can do this, no one can do that. I'm like, well, look, this is a buy-to-let property. I need to make sure that I'm going to get someone in there. So if I can't get someone in there, then I need to negotiate with you because I'm going to losing the year's worth of rent.
Yeah, I need to work. Exactly.
So I managed to get 35 grand off, thankfully.
It's good timing for you then.
Yeah, perfect. Obviously, being in the industry, it sort of helps a little bit. But in hindsight, I would do it again, and I'd probably advise people that are sort of within this job. I work for the vendor. I've got to get them as much money as possible. But for friends and family, we sort of tell them, look, don't go beyond your means, because if the day comes when interest rates rise,
this is what we're going to start seeing. People that are going to come up to their end of the fixed term are going to think, actually, I can't afford to do this. Yeah. So it's just it's a waiting game. We're going to have to wait and see how things pan out. But in terms of work, I'm sure you've seen the same. It's just there's still work is there. Yeah, still.
I mean, even yesterday, interest rates rose another 0.25%. We're at 4.5% now.
I reckon it'll go one more probably.
My colleague thinks we're going to hit the 5% mark, but we'll see. Hopefully, it doesn't. Well, it probably will, but let's see. I mean, obviously, inflation and the economic crisis that we're in, they need to find the money somewhere, and unfortunately, we're the ones that pay the price. So yeah, I mean, we've got some more sort of in-depth questions that are all different. Been asking.
No problem.
I want to know. Obviously, being a estate agent, I know the answer myself, but it's nice for it to come from someone that's professional about it. So one of the sort of top ones is, what is the conveyancing process, and what does it involve?
Yeah, absolutely. So the conveyancing process, obviously, they come to you first. You'd find them or sell their house for them. At that point, my advice is, do work with solicitors that work with agents, because it does help. When you've got a good, healthy relationship between estate agent and solicitor, your transaction will go smoothly.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
No, there is a bit of a stigma in the industry, and us and them, but I think that needs to go, because ultimately we want the same thing.
Oh, we want the end goal to be finished.
The end goal to, get the client in or out, depending on who we're acting for, and get it completed as quickly as possible with the client being happy.
Definitely.
So if we work together doing that, I don't see how there's a negative effect on that. As long as we're working in the same direction, if there's something I need you to chase, you do that. You say, oh, Ismail, I need this done. We get it done. But, ultimately, that's how it starts. Comes to us, you get a quote from us. Hopefully you're happy with the quote, move forward. And then, do you want me to start sale first, purchase first?
Either or, really.
But general overview. So, initial thing is you fill out all your forms, whether you're buying or selling, giving us all the information we need to create your file. And then at that point, if you're selling, you'd fill out forms, what's called protocol forms if it's a residential, CPSC if it's a commercial, which gives us and the buyer all the information we need to, create the draft contract pack to give over to them.
Yeah.
So once that's all completed, we issue papers or receive papers, depending on what side we're on. And then those papers would get reviewed. So in the background, if you're buying with a mortgage, you're doing your mortgage application, that's coming through. The moment we get the draft papers from the sellers, if we're the buyers, we'd issue searches, submit the searches. In terms of searches, generally speaking, we do local authority, which looks at any planning issues. If there's been an extension, we will find out if it's got the relevant paperwork, planning, building regs, things like that. The other one is the environmental search. So just making sure there's no contamination in the local area, making sure there's no issues in that sense. And the last one that we normally do is the drainage and water search. And that covers, making sure it's all connected. It can come up in that you weren't aware it's not connected to mains. There might be a cesspit or a septic tank or something else that can come up in those searches that will help you, look forward and know exactly what you're buying. At that point, the respective solicitors will raise inquiries. So what that means is we run through all the documentation we receive, ask any questions based on the information. So whether that's legal points, or sometimes the client will go, look, I bought this property, but I really want to know X, Y, Z. And we'll make sure that that's relayed to the other side, get the information that we need from that. Or, for example, if there's certain items in the property that you want to make sure are left or taken, or it's a bit dilapidated, you make sure it's cleaned out.
It's like clearing the loft and the garage.
Yeah, I mean, the forms that they will fill out that I mentioned normally will cover it, but sometimes there might be a specific item that you want clarified, like curtains, for example. And often there's some negotiation on sometimes if they're a bit new, they'll try and sell them and things like that. But ultimately, at that stage, we'll be asking questions. So if you're selling, you'd expect to receive some questions from your solicitor. The solicitor will always try and answer as many as they can. The legal ones they will answer. But anything specific to the property will pass on to the client. So the quicker that gets answered back, the quicker we can relay it over to the other side. And in the meantime, you'd hope that searches would come back, your mortgage offer would come back. And then once everything's satisfactorily answered, you start looking at dates for
Exchanging, completion. Now, how long would you say the conveyancing process should take or could take?
Yes, I mean, it varies massively whether it's leasehold or freehold.
Yeah.
I didn't really touch on leasehold in that, but with a leasehold property, there are additional elements. You've got third parties in the sense that you've got to refer to managing agents, freeholders. Sometimes you've got to get packs from both, which, it can take time.
Even longer.
Yeah, it can take time. The other thing at the moment, I'm sure you found it in your sales, is there are a lot of, I won't say issues with leasehold, but historic problems with leaseholds that now have to be fixed because lenders are picking up on it. For example, ground rent is a massive issue at the moment.
Well, the cladding for the EWS forms and stuff like that.
I've got the Building Safety Act, which, if I'm honest, is not a very well written act at all. The legislation is poor, which just opens up a can of worms. And solicitors are struggling because the lenders are effectively saying, look, you look at that.
Yeah. There's a bit of ambiguity in it.
Too ambiguous. It's putting the onus on the solicitor to answer planning issues and safety issues, which we're not qualified to do. My job is to look at the legal title, make sure that's correct. But in terms of timeframes, I think with a straightforward freehold, 8 to 10 weeks is probably realistic.
Good solicitor like yourself.
You get that? I mean, it depends. If you got solicitors and agents all working together, that you can reduce those times. But if you're looking at realistically, probably 8 to 10 weeks. Leasehold, it varies. You're looking probably at least 12 weeks, and that's if everyone is pulling in the direction, and especially as long as there's no deed of variation required. So a deed of variation is when we look at a lease, maybe there is a ground rent issue, it's too high, cladding issue, things like that, and the wording of the lease needs to change. So if that happens, then we, as a buyer solicitor, would ask for that to be varied. But that can't just be the seller going, okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. It has to go up to the management company or to the freeholder. So
agreed all round, basically.
Has to agree it, and your lender, because ultimately it's you and your lender.
Borrowing the money from them.
So we need to, I think people sometimes forget that you're my client, but actually the bank that you've chosen is also my client. So I have to make sure that this property is good for you and them at the same time.
Yeah, because they're putting a big chunk, the majority of it down most of the time, Would you say there's a big difference between commercial and residential conveyancing?
Do you know what? There's a lot of people think there is, but ultimately the process is near enough the same. The forms may be different. The search is a bit more expensive just because it's commercial, but ultimately the process itself is near enough the same. With a commercial, it depends on what type of commercial you do. I mean, for your run-of-the-mill, the shops on the high street, kebab shops, laundrettes, things like that. Similar process. You tend to, I find with commercials, because of the way the residential is, it's quite regimented with residential. With a commercial, you may have it where there's a flurry of work done, there's something that might be waited for, then again there's a flurry of work. But in terms of process, it's still the same. Instead of the forms, there's a different type of form you fill in. You still fill those in, send them off. Searches are done. If you're getting finance, you still get the finance in the same way.
Inquiries still have to be raised.
Still raise inquiries. The inquiries might vary slightly, call suit. Because, for example, you're not going to be talking about the planning use and what is being seen there because it's a house. But commercial, you have to make sure that appropriate planning permission is in place for the
right usage
that you want to do. And ultimately, it's just making sure that my job is to make sure that the person buying is buying something that they, it's not a problem. Yeah. It's not, 3-4 years down the line when you try and sell it or remortgage it, you're not going to have a problem. I need to make sure that this property is good for you, because sometimes it might look amazing financially, but when you look at the legals,
it doesn't look great.
I will say to the client, I'll be honest with the client and say, it's not worth proceeding. You proceed at your own risk at that point.
But then if you don't do that on the later end, back end of things, you can get sued. You don't want that to come back on you. So best to be straight up and up from the beginning with them. Now, when it comes down to costs, what fees and costs can you expect? Obviously, residential and commercial is slightly different. But what can you expect from that?
Well, if we look at residential, you're going to look at obviously your solicitor's costs. If you're selling, you'll obviously have agents' costs and things like that involved as well. If it's leasehold and you're selling, you have to buy a management pack, what's called a leasehold management pack. And what that is, that's a pre-made pack by whoever manages the property. giving, the buyer all the information they need on service charges, arrears, major works, things like that are going to come up in the property, so that the buyer has all the information they need to proceed. Sometimes with sales and certain blocks, you need 2 of those packs, as I mentioned, because the freeholder will have 1 pack, the management company will have their own pack. If you're buying, and linked again with the leasehold, is in those packs, you'll see that they mention what's called notice fees, potentially a certificate of compliance. These are post-completion fees payable by the buyer, which a solicitor wouldn't be able to account for in a quote. So you may find that the solicitor says, "Oh, actually, you've got to now pay a few £100 more," but that's not going to the solicitor, and it's not something. Unfortunately, sometimes clients are like, "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" But it's not something we can know. We can advise you there may be fees, which all our quotes say, but ultimately we can't, as the solicitor, until we get the pack in our hand.
Part of the disbursements, I think they call it, or something like that.
So basically, for example, the notice is once you've bought the property, you notify the management company or the freeholder that you are now the owner, so that future invoices and correspondence comes to you. So that's the fee for that. Sometimes, in order to comply with that, management companies and freeholders put what's called a restriction on the title, which just notifies that land reg to say, have you done all of this before we register it? To give that certificate, sometimes they charge an additional charge. The other thing they ask for sometimes is what's called a deed of covenant, which again is you as the buyer signing a document to say, yeah, all the documents in this lease, all the covenants in this lease, I'm going to abide by it as the new buyer. And you sign that, and there's sometimes a fee for that. It varies massively.
They're basically all like administrational costs.
Fees. In terms of legal fees, you obviously got your solicitor's fees, and disbursements are, land registration fees, stamp duty. Depends.
That's a big chunk that some people always forget as well.
You must when you're doing your sums.
And that varies depending if it's your first property or if you're onwards. A
lot of people don't realise the qualifications for each of the bands. So, for example, they'll say, well, I don't own one currently, so I'm not a first-time buyer. Well, no. So first-time buyer is you have never, ever owned one. This is the very first one.
Yeah, I'm selling this. I'm a first-time buyer again. No.
It doesn't work like that. And also, another thing people miss is the high rate band is actually anywhere in the world. So although you may not own one here, it's technically speaking, do you, at the end of this transaction, will you own more than one property anywhere else in the world? You may have one back home, not realise that is then going to make you, it's going to cause you to have additional stamp duty here.
Definitely. That's something that most people don't know, to be fair. So that's a very good tip. What about legal implications of buying property with somebody else? So let's say, for example, me and you was going to buy a property together. What are the legal implications behind that?
When you buy jointly in this country, there's 2 ways. There's 3 really of how you hold the property. We would both own it. So the first one is called joint tenants. So it says what it is. We both own it jointly. If anything, God forbid, was to happen to one, it would pass to the other one automatically. That's what joint tenants is. The other option is you can still own it 50-50 for what's called tenants in common. So what that means is I can own my 50 share, but when I pass, I write in my will that I want to go to my wife, for example. What that means is my share doesn't automatically pass to you. We own it jointly, but we can do whatever we want with our respective.
Someone else can take your share.
Respective shares, which means if anything will happen to me and it passes on, then you jointly own it with
whoever is passed.
Yeah, exactly. The third option is tenants in common again, but you can determine what shares you own. So you might have put more money in, for example, and you own 70%, I own 30%, and that can get determined in that way. But in terms of implications, it's just making sure from the start that when you buy it, if you're going to rent it out, making it clear as to who's going to get what. Is it just going to be a straight 50-50? Is the mortgage cost split? Are the bills split? Is the income from it split? A good way of determining that and putting it down in writing is a deed of trust. So even though you might say, yeah, it's 50-50, you can, in addition to that, do a deed of trust and determine clearly exactly what
it's all in black and white.
It's in black and white. It's signed. It's abide by. You can put a note on the title as well. The solicitor can register that against the title, but effectively it will say you cannot do anything with this property unless you abide by the deed of trust. So that way, if it does come to it and you need to sell it, the solicitor can look at that deed and say, right, you're due X amount, you're due X amount based on what you guys agreed. And obviously that deed can also be changed as many times as you want. It's not set in stone. sign it, you can do a new one, you can do 10 by the time you actually come to you. If your circumstances change, you can change it. But it's always good to document.
So there's several different options, guys. So obviously, if you want to re-listen to that, rewind it and watch over it again, because there are different options for different ways to go down. Now, what about the transfer of ownership of property? How can a solicitor help with that?
Yeah, so the transfer of ownership can be a really simple thing. Parents may wish to just pass the property on to their children, or I want to pass it to my brother. The simplest way of doing that is when if it's a mortgage-free property, it's your property, you can transfer it to whoever you want. If you're doing it as a gift, then there's no stamp duty. But if there is a mortgage on the property, this is an important point that often people don't realise is, I may be gifting my property to you, but I've got a 300 grand mortgage still on my property. So although you're not paying anything for it,
yes, you got to service that loan still.
It's deemed that you've effectively bought it for whatever is left on the loan, which then means you've effectively bought it for 300 grand, even though no money's changed hands, and then stamp duty kicks in. So it's always important to look at, is there a mortgage on the property? Has the lender consented to the transfer? Because ultimately, for example, again, it goes back to the analogy, we both own the property together. I'm coming away from it, so I'm going to give my share to you so you own all of it, but we've got a mortgage on the property. You need to speak to your lender first.
Okay, consent from the lender, really, then.
Because ultimately, if you think about a lender's point of view, at the moment, I've got two people that I can claim liability from if no one pays.
Yes.
If that one person falls off, can this person on his own actually
afford to pay it? Yeah.
So you got to go through that whole process.
And most of the case, it's not.
Yeah, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is. Sometimes they'll say, look, carry on with the mortgage as it is. We'll just give you consent to come off. Sometimes you may have to completely remortgage in your sole name to pay off the joint, and you do a simultaneous transaction to take the person off. But it's a relatively simple process, the removal of transfer. It's just a TR1 documentation, which is the form that we use to change ownership. Like I said, when there's no mortgage, it's a very simple process. But when there's a mortgage involved, there are a few, like I said, just key elements like stamp duty, lender consent, that you just need to be careful of.
Perfect. Now, finally, there is this last one, which has come up quite a lot. What should I do if I have any concerns or issues during the conveyancing process?
Yeah. My view is always speak to your solicitor. If you're not happy with something, is it in relation to the house itself, or is it in relation to the service?
It's come up from both sides. So it's come up with the house being an issue with the property, and they've seen something in the paperwork they're not quite sure about. And the other question is being like, what if I'm not happy with the service that I'm actually receiving from the solicitor?
If I go the first one first.
Go for it.
If there is a problem, if there's something you're not sure of, no question is stupid.
Yeah.
This is probably one of the biggest transactions you're going to do in your life.
Correct.
With property. The amount of money that's going round in it. Ask. The reason you've employed a solicitor is to cover is to do this for you. So if you're not sure, so if you've got a report and it's mentioned something and you don't quite understand it, ask the question. Ask the question, get the answer you want. Because ultimately, you're the one that's going to be living in it or renting it, or it's going to be your property. Once the solicitor's done their job and you sign off to say, yeah, I'm happy with everything, it's yours. So if you're not sure and if you're not happy with something, I've had clients say, look, I've been in and there's this, that and the other. And ultimately I said, what do you think? Mm-hmm. I can give you my opinion, but ultimately it's your money. You're the one that's going to part with the money.
Right.
So my advice on that is get as much information as you can. Ask as many questions as you can to get to the bottom of, if you've got an issue, to resolve it.
And be sure of what you're doing.
100% sure. If you're doubting something, then it's probably there is something wrong.
Because it's not like rental property, is it really, where you go in, like you can move out a year after. You can always try and sell it a year after, but if there's something that's not stacking up for you, to sell and get rid of the mortgage.
If it's not stacking up for you, it's probably not going to stack up for someone else. There is something there for you to have a worry about. So ask your solicitor, ask your legal advisor, get to the bottom of that answer that you want. And then obviously if they give you a satisfactory answer and you tick your box, move on. But if you come to the point where you're asking questions, the solicitor can't give you the answer you need because maybe they can't physically give you that answer because of the information is lacking from the seller, for example.
Sometimes when they put not known on the form, loads of not known, oh my God, how do you get to the bottom of that?
The problem is the solicitor can't, we don't then do an additional investigation to make sure those not knowns are actually not knowns. All we can do is do the legal checks, the searches, report back to you. You may do your own surveys and get, builders and people to come into
Or HF home buyer surveys and report.
I mean, that's the only way. Just to get my advice is do all the searches you can, the surveys you can, be as crystal clear as what you're purchasing. And in terms of the second point, that's also important, because if you lose trust in your solicitor, that's an issue. If you're not happy with what they're doing, the first point of call is bringing it up with them. Bring it up with your legal advisor. Say to them, look, I'm not happy with this. Maybe it's communication. Maybe I'm calling, never getting a call back. It could be anything. Maybe there's certain things that you've asked questions, they've not answered them. It could be anything.
Yes.
If you've got a service issue, raise it with the solicitor first. If it doesn't resolve, you can go one up. You can go to ask for their complaints. First, you have to make a formal complaint. That's the process. Raise it with your actual fee earner. If you're not happy with that, raise it with the superior. So make a formal written complaint. If you're then not happy with the response given by the firm, then you can then take it to the ombudsman, legal ombudsman, and make a complaint that way. They will then investigate it. They ask the firm, they ask the client for all the information, and they will come out with a decision. Obviously, we don't want that to happen, and most of the time, if you do have a frank conversation,
it can get resolved.
It may be that certain things have happened, you didn't get a call back, but if you bring it up and say, look, I was expecting, you told me you were getting a call and I didn't get one, it's then down to that solicitor to make sure they are doing what they are telling you to do. I think the worst thing is saying to a client, oh, I'm going to do this.
They're not delivering on that.
I'm better off saying, look, realistically, I'm going to look at it tonight, but you might not get the report till tomorrow.
Yes.
Just
Yeah, makes sense.
The more you start backtracking on yourself, that's when the problem.
All about communication, really, isn't it?
It is 100%. That's one of the most important things in this job, because there's so many people that we need to communicate with, whether it's yourselves as in agents, brokers, other side, you as well as the client. It's keeping those avenues of communication and helping each other to do their respective part. Let the broker do their job, the agent do their job, and work together to get these transactions through for everyone.
Ismail, thank you very much. Guys, thank you for coming on. Thank you for watching the show. Don't forget to leave us a comment, subscribe. I'll put all of Ismail's details in the description below. So if you need any advice or need to reach out, feel free to contact him as well. Obviously, you can always reach out through us, and we'll also put you in touch with him. Not a problem at all. But look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you again.
Take care. Bye-bye.